Hello everyone. In this screencast, I'm going to give you some instructions about how to write summaries. And while some of these instructions will be specifically about how to write summaries for our class, especially for our large annotated bibliography project, there's also a lot of good advice in here for how to approach summary writing in other classes. I doubt that any one of you has gotten to this point in your educations without having to write summaries and submit them to various teachers. But in our class, I want you to write your summaries in a very particular way for the annotated bibliography. And so this screencast I provided in part so that I can just be crystal clear about what my expectations are. Let's start by considering what the function of a summary is. A summary should, on the one hand, synthesize a longer reading, but on the other hand, it ought to condense that longer reading. And ultimately, it should portray that reading as accurately and as objectively as possible. Now, assuming that you're writing these summaries for an external audience, in other words, it's not just for you, you haven't decided to do this, for instance, if you're completing a large research project in another class and you're afraid you won't remember what all the different sources have said unless you write a summary, so you just do it for yourself as a study aid. But instead, assuming that you are going to give these summaries to an external audience, you want to write that summary as if your audience has not read the original source. So in the summary then, you want to aim to portray that source so accurately that your audience member will feel confident in his or her understanding it, almost like he or she read the original instead of your summary. By writing a summary in that way, you establish your own credibility as a writer. If you make a mistake in a summary, for instance, maybe you leave out one big section of the essay, or you've misread it and you've misunderstood what the author was arguing, or maybe you hated the article and you've ended up letting that sort of bias about the article creep into your summary, your reader is not going to think less of the original source or the original author. They're going to think less of you because they can't trust your interpretation of that original source. Now there's a tension between what I'm asking you to do. On the one hand, in summaries, I'm saying you have to synthesize this entire source. On the other hand, I'm saying you have to condense it. Well, why is there a tension there? Because a synthesis is a combination or a composition of parts or elements so as to form a whole. So the focus in that definition really ought to be on the last word, on the whole. You want to portray the whole article. On the other hand, I'm asking you to condense it. A summary is a condensation, a compression of a written or spoken work into a more concise form. So when you're synthesizing, you as a summary writer may feel like you want to expound or expand or extrapolate that article that you have just read. But when you're trying to keep condensing in mind, you as a summary writer may feel like you need to be brief. So how do you balance these two competing instructions from this genre, really, a summary writing genre? Well, one thing I would suggest is to balance these two things. In other words, to balance on the one hand being thorough and on the other hand being brief. I think you should read each original source and look for sections of that source that center around subclaims and or subtopics. Now, I'm going to discuss claims far more in a later PowerPoint on academic argumentation. But for now, let's just say that a claim is the same thing as a thesis. And so you're looking for subtheses or major points that appear throughout the article. Now, sometimes the author of the original article may have used headings, and those can be a terrific guide in looking for major points of the article that you're trying to summarize. If there aren't any headings, and headings are not always typical in some fields, then imagine when you're reading it that you work at a publishing house and an editor has asked you to come in and insert some headings into this article before it's published so that it will be more reader friendly. Ask yourself, where would you put those headings and what would you name them? And that can go a long way toward identifying these major points in the article that you need to make sure you include in your summary. Now let me give you a little bit of advice about actually writing these summaries, and this comes from a person who does this a lot. What I always do when I'm writing summaries for a major project, or when I am writing an annotated bibliography that I hope to get published, I start by previewing the source. Now what do I mean by that? First, I just consider the title. Especially in academic writing, sometimes titles can almost be a statement of the claim. The second thing I do is I read the abstract, but I kind of read it skeptically. The reason I say that is sometimes, depending on the publication, depending on the discipline, the folks who write those abstracts are not always the people who wrote the articles. And so it's not that unusual for me to finish reading an article and to realize that the abstract writer was just wrong, that they had misread the source. So you want to read those, but be careful. Don't always trust what they say to you. Next, quickly scan the introduction. Just quick scan down through the first few paragraphs or the first section and see what are the major concepts that are being invoked in that introduction. And then quickly scan the conclusion. Are those same concepts coming back up? Are there additional concepts? Has the author stated or restated a claim, the ultimate thesis of the article? And all this does, this previewing, it sensitizes you to the main things to look out for as you begin the actual reading of the text. When you're writing summaries, you should read the text carefully, and I mean read every single word of it. The only time that you don't want to read every single word of a text is if your teacher, for instance, if you've been assigned to write summaries, tells you not to. But in general, the expectation is that you're going to have read every single word in that text and read it carefully. You also want to make comments on the source as you read, and you can do this in whatever way is most comfortable to you. Sometimes I will print out articles and I will write on them in the margins. Other times, if I am not sure that an article is going to be useful, or if I just don't want to waste the paper, I will save the article as a PDF, and then I will use the highlighting tool that's in Adobe Acrobat and the little comment tool. The comment tool looks almost like the dialogue bubble that you would see in a comic book, right? And I insert comments that way. The next thing you want to do is to develop a system for identifying subclaims and sections and the evidence and the developed points that come after that. So for instance, let's say that I'm reading a section in an article and an author has made a subclaim, and if I start to see evidence, I will usually start to number it because I just want to say, well, what's the evidence to back up that point? Sometimes I use a system of smiley faces and unhappy faces. If I think one section of the article has been especially well defended, I'll put smiley faces throughout to say, oh, that's a good point. If there's a claim in the article somewhere that doesn't have any evidence to back it up, I might put an unhappy face. So whatever the system is, you need to come up with a system for marking as you read through these sources really carefully. As soon as you have finished reading your source, you want to start writing a rough draft of that summary. Why do I say to do it immediately after? Because it will be quicker for you. If you wait and you say, oh, well, I've read it, but I'll come back and write the summary tomorrow, a lot of times you will have forgotten some major things that were in that summary, or rather in that original source. So if you just go ahead and just write a rough draft summary down, that's the best way to go about this. When you're writing that rough draft summary, make your very first sentence the thesis or the claim of the source. And by that I mean the overarching thesis or the overarching claim. What's the point? Sometimes you'll be lucky enough and the writer will have said something like, in this article I prove that X, X, and Y, Y, right? A lot of times, and that can depend on the discipline too. In my discipline, that almost never happens. Instead, I find that I have to write the thesis or claim in my own words after I have read the article carefully and sort of surmised what the author's main point is. You want to then follow by listing each subclaim and the primary evidence used to prove it. Now let me just kind of talk through a quick example of this. Let's say that you are a criminal justice major and maybe you've decided that you want your writing topic for our class to be the United States death penalty. And you know that that's too broad, and so you've decided to focus on the United States death penalty and race. Okay? So maybe for the annotated bibliography, you read an article about race and the death penalty, and the author says that we should get rid of the U.S. death penalty because it is racist. So that might be the overarching thesis or claim. But now that author is almost certainly going to have to include subclaims in order to get you to agree with him or her. So maybe one subclaim says that racism runs throughout the U.S. Justice system, and maybe one section, for instance, is about how people of color are far more likely to be targeted first by the police for questioning and arrest, and then second by DAs, district attorneys, for charges. So those would be my subclaims, and probably the evidence, I'm going to maybe have statistics about the race of people who are pulled over in traffic stops, or I'm going to have case studies of a particular district attorney who was far more likely to bring charges against someone of color. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say make sure you have the major subclaims and the major evidence that's used to prove those subclaims. Now, if you were only writing this summary for yourself, like I mentioned earlier, if it were part of a large research project and you were only doing it as a study aid for yourself, you could stop there. But because you're writing this summary to be submitted to an external audience, now you have to revise it. So after you have that rough sketch of your summary hammered out, you want to go back and begin to craft it for your audience. How do you do that? Well, first of all, remember the purpose of the summary. You want to write the summary to help readers completely understand that original source. There shouldn't be any major point that you've left out. Additionally, you do want the summary to help you remember the important parts of a given source, because you may be able to use some of these sources throughout the rest of the class, using them in your rhetorical analysis, for instance, or using them in your multimodal assignment. Now let's talk about summary writing, the parts of the summary in a little bit more detail. The claim or the thesis, I want you to make the original source, okay, their claim or their thesis, your first sentence. And as I say, sometimes this might be overtly stated, often in an introduction, but other times you're going to have to tease out just what is the claim, what is this author's point. I want you to include the author's name, the title of the work, and the type of source in your statement of this claim. So let me give you an example. This would be an appropriate first sentence for a summary for our class. In his editorial, and there you see that I have the type of source mentioned, So in his editorial, the death penalty affirms life, and that's the title of this editorial. Ed Koch, okay, so there's the author's name, argues for the death penalty by refuting capital punishment abolitionists' concerns, ultimately stating that any punishment less than death reveals diminished concern for the lives of homicide victims. You can also choose to put in this first sentence the author's title or their profession. So Ed Koch was when he argued this in this editorial in the New York Times, he was the former mayor of New York City. So I could rewrite this and say, in his editorial, the death penalty affirms life, former New York City Mayor Ed Koch argues, and then go on. But you see there that I have the author's name, the title of the work, the type of the source, and then the claim of the entire piece. The next thing you've got to think about is, how are you going to organize your summary? You should have a logical organizational pattern of the summary, and that organization, it may mirror the organization of the original source, but it's just as likely that it won't. So what do I mean? I mean that your summary could be chronological. You could summarize in the same order that if a reader went to the original source, he or she would read those points in that same order. But you might end up, sometimes academic writing, as you guys know, is not always well written. And so you don't want your summary to be poorly written because the original source was, right? So you may decide that you're going to organize your summary differently. Maybe you're going to start with the author's most important point, and you're going to organize to the least important point. Okay? So you have to make this decision very consciously. Next, the development of the summary. That is, what information do you put in this summary? In determining your organization, you want to be sure that every single important point has been included. So you want to refer again to what are the sections of the article, what are the subclaims that are made. We know you've got the claim in there already. It's the first sentence every time. But what comes after that? Well, you want to make sure that you discuss in a few sentences at least every subclaim and every major section. And you want to flesh out the development of each one of those subclaims or sections. And to do so, consider the evidence or the supporting reasoning that the original author included in this article that you're summarizing. Finally, all that's left to do is polish the summary. How do you do that? Well, first, reread your summary and ask yourself, have I omitted any major points of this article? If so, you want to include those. The second thing you want to do, though, is to say, now have I been repetitive anywhere? Or have I included any information that it might be sort of important, but it's not vitally important, it's not necessary? If so, I can delete that information. And you see again this tension, right? Of the first instruction on this slide tells you be thorough, include anything that's really important. And then the second instruction says, but remember, these are supposed to be short, so delete anything that's not really important and certainly anything that's been repetitive. Similarly, you want to make sure that you've used very precise, specific language. If you do that, it's going to add to the summary's clarity and also its brevity. Summary writing is almost like writing a poem. Because it's shorter than, say, writing a novel, you have to use the most powerful words you can use at any given time so that you can make the piece as short as it can be. Now, regarding plagiarism, you can plagiarize in a summary, even a summary that's in an annotated bibliography. And that might seem sort of impossible because you've got as we know in the annotated bibliographies, you've got the works cited entry or the bibliographical entry just above the summary. So how in the world could you plagiarize? Well, you would do so if you used language that was too close to the original language that was in that article without giving the original author credit for that language. So you want to reread your summary and determine whether you've paraphrased or you've quoted anywhere therein, because we're using MLA style in these annotated bibliographies. If you've paraphrased or you've quoted, there should be a page number at the end of every sentence where you've done that. Now, grammar and mechanics. Make sure that you've provided transitions between the parts of your summaries. Sometimes summaries can almost feel like you're going too fast down a side street and you hit a series of speed bumps, right? Just boom, boom, boom. Imagine how that would feel if you were in a car and you were going really fast and you hit a series of speed bumps. You want your summary not to feel that way. You want it to feel very smooth, right? So how can you do that? You can do that by fluidly incorporating any paraphrases or quotes using attribution phrases like "as Koch says," right? Or "according to Koch," or "Koch continues," right? Those kinds of phrases not only give attribution to your source, but they can transition between parts of your summary. Remember, you do not want to rewrite the entire piece. While there's no magic length of summaries, the length and the complexity of the original source is probably going to determine how long your summary should be. So for instance, if I have a really long article, and my article is 25 pages from an academic journal, I'm probably not going to have a one-paragraph summary. The same thing is true, though, if I have a short 3-page article. Well, I'm probably not going to have a 2-page summary, right? So length matters, but also complexity matters. You can have a very short article that is highly complex and it's just very dense, or you can have a long article that might be just like it might have a case study in there that can be summarized really easily. So the length and the complexity of the source that you're summarizing ought to help you in determining how long the summary should be. Also, use your own wording when you're writing these summaries whenever you can. One reason that teachers ask you to write summaries is if you can restate an article in your own language, it shows that you have been able to understand it completely. You might even try writing the rough drafts of your summaries without looking back at the original at all. Just slide the original to the other side of your desk or close that window on your computer and try to write the summary right then. That'll help you to use your own language more than if you were sitting and looking at the original the entire time. You can always come back to the original later, but just that first draft of the summary, you might try to write it without actually looking at the original source. Okay, so that gives you some instructions about how to go about writing the summaries. Now keep in mind that you should see our annotated bibliography assignment sheet, because after your summaries for that annotated bibliography, you also have to include those very short archaeological paragraphs, and those are completely explained in the annotated bibliography assignment sheet. You can also check out an annotated bibliography that a student group from a previous course wrote, and I've put that on there, and I've even left therein my grading comments so that you could see they did a great job on that annotated bibliography. If they'd done a poor job, I wouldn't have shared it with you, right? I want you to see a good example, but even those students could have done a bit better, so you can see the kind of feedback that I gave those students by checking out that Word document that's in the week 1 block on our As You Learn site. Okay, folks. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope this was helpful.